Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan, and I'm here with Ethan Fox. And one of the most common questions that I get in a channeled session is, what is my soul's purpose and why did I come to planet Earth? So we thought we would dedicate an entire show to this topic, knowing, of course, there's many different directions that we can take it. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind, I think personally, is that a soul's purpose is not one thing. We tend to think very linearly here on planet Earth. And while certainly I believe all of us come with an intention and spiritual gifts and abilities that we're meant to use in some very purposeful way, we should keep in mind that we're here to do many things. And just because we may not have quote unquote awakened to that one spiritual purpose yet, doesn't mean that everything we haven't already done in our life was a contributing factor to this purpose. And so one of the things the guides always remind us is that our purpose can express in multiple dimensions. And we have to be careful about getting caught up in this third to fifth dimensional type of, separation when we go into this topic, although it's inevitable we have to discuss it. Just because we may be doing something in a more conventional or third dimensional light doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong or isn't a contributing factor in how we're meant to change that reality. And so often what we'll explore in our channeled sessions with the guides first, before we go forward into, what are those things that we're here to do, is what have we done before, both in this lifetime and in past lifetimes.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And if to share some of my own story and identifying where I've ended up in my life, I think it's easy, especially when we're looking at things from a spiritual context. We think that we're supposed to abandon everything and go in some other direction, but it's really not quite that extreme in most cases. Like in my case, everything that I do today and the work that I do is a combination of everything I've done since childhood and that I didn't really know. And I find that the patterns of what you were here to experience and do were always there. Now, I think, first of all, it's hard, you can't really not be on track, but because your soul is going to guide you and direct you. But there are forces in the current Earth's timeline that attempt to sort of derail us all the time to where we may not live to the fullest potential of that, even though we may scratch the surface of it. But if I look at my life, even at a very young age, I was in front of audiences and performing or singing or something like that. And that element has been there, that thread has been there throughout my life, and even now expressing in this way. So if you look at your life from childhood onward and you try to identify those aspects of things that you were interested in, another personal interest of mine from young childhood, and when I was, I would say, even 3 years old, 3 years old to 14 years old, I was very much into electronics and technology. I was fixing things when I was a very young child. 14 years old, I was writing computer software, and those interests in technology and electronics have played a role in what I'm doing today. This studio, for example, although you can't see it on camera, is a very highly customized technological studio. And while everybody assumes that we have a camera crew in here, everything is set up to run automatically. So actually, there is no sound crew or camera crew. It was wired that way, and this comes from my experience in good part of my life working with electronics and technology and camera equipment and video equipment and sound equipment. In my late teens and 20s, I was a DJ and ran an entertainment company and had to learn about audio equipment and video equipment and things like that. So I was a photographer for periods of my life. So you can see all of those elements present in what I'm doing today. In my teens, or rather in my 20s and 30s, I was speaking in front of audiences at different spiritual churches and started a spiritual organization at that age as well. So, so I think if you look at your life from that perspective and you look through the things that you've done in the past and the interests you've had and the areas that you were really fascinated by. Another thing that as a very young child, I was very artistic, and later on in life, for a period of time, ran a marketing, design, branding agency. So you can see the elements of design even in this room and a lot of the stuff we do. So that's what we need to look at, is look at all those things that we have done throughout our lives, the things that we've gravitated towards that gave us the most passion and interest and curiosity, and things that we enjoyed doing that weren't really work to us. Now, most of us today, though, in modern society, we're pushed into a very narrow box. So we are taught that we need to go to school, get a degree, get a job somewhere, and just do whatever that job is. And so it tends to narrow the field of expression. I think if human beings were allowed to just be who they are, we would go out into the world and do all kinds of amazing, unique things and create incredible inventions and things like that. But society is made to limit our creativity. And so as a result, maybe you find yourself as an engineer, which I actually, being Indian, that's what I thought I was supposed to do because I was into electronics and computers and things like that. And my family thought I'm going to be an engineer. And so I went to school for engineering. And now I never became an engineer, but the vast majority of people like me would have ended up in that role. And maybe I would have still expressed some of those talents and interests in that engineering field, but it wouldn't have allowed the full range of creativity that I had just doing my own thing in life. And so I think a lot of people, they sort of squelch their full potential of their life's purpose because they tend to have boxes around what they can express because of the work they have or whatever life they choose, or living in a particular society or a family where you're expected to live to certain standards or expectations without allowing yourself to fully express and be free. So the first place I would begin is an exploration of your whole life. And when I worked with light workers over the years, that's what I would do, is I would have them write out their whole life story and I would read through it, and it would give me clues as to what they were really here to do. And then we would take those things and form it into something new that they could go out into the world and express in a spiritual way. Now, the fact that I also have had a thread of spiritual interests and studies and people like Micheila, channels, and people who were in the spiritual space in my life for all my adult late years also is an indication that a spiritual direction was another potential. So if I take all the elements that I just mentioned, and there are plenty of others too, and I put them together into one life expression that is my soul's purpose, it would, one of the possible ways that could look is everything that you're seeing right now and all the things that I've been doing with my life. And in the same way, you need to do the same. Even if you find yourself in a very mainstream life or career path right now, if you go back over your life journey, as I just did with mine, and put those pieces together in a new way that allows you to go out and be yourself and to live fully, then you'll be able to create that, more full expression of your soul's purpose. Have you had a similar experience in your life? Maybe you can share that.
Yeah, definitely I have. I was just listening as you were bringing all this through, and often the guides will say that our spiritual purpose or our spiritual gifts, they are entangled in a collective intention. So they aren't really decided on by us in terms of when they're meant to emerge. And, I think we can both speak to that in terms of awakening, because our awakening is timed to the collective's readiness to receive something from us in a brand new way. So all of that stuff that we do before, it's purposeful in that it's providing the vocabulary and the education and the wisdom and the foundation to actually support some bigger legacy, right? Or offering that we're here to provide humanity. And I've had all of the very similar common threads. I was on stage in all my high school musicals. I was a dancer, but one of the most prominent passions that I had was writing. I was always a writer. I won first place in the poetry contest, and that kind of stuff. And I know those of you who follow channeled work know that the writing is a big, huge piece for me. So I even went into journalism and public relations because I loved writing so much. Little did I know I was going to use all of that in a more metaphysical way. So all of these things that we do are purposeful, yet we're told they are not. So I think if we're going to talk about a soul's purpose, we have to talk about, the collective landscape and why all of a sudden we're feeling this organic need to be of service and to be purposeful in what we're here to do, because it's been suppressed in us for so long. In the book, the guides talk about the earth and how from really, not in every civilization, right? But from the beginning of this period of time that we're in, that those of us chose to incarnate, there's been a foundation of fear that has been instilled within us for everything that we're taught to do. So we think our purpose is to go out and make money and to, feed our families and to buy a house and to get an education. And those things are important, but the purpose behind them, the intention behind them, doesn't often match the intention coming from the heavens. So when the guides take us up to the very highest level and say, this was your intention for coming, it's usually a very broad scope intention. And I'll give you an example. We contract a disease and we think, well, that's because we have karma or we did something wrong or we're meant to suffer. But within that experience, there is a thread of energy leading us to our purpose. Everything that we do and everything we experience within that period of time is like that deep immersion into the mystery school that gives us everything that we need to do the things that we're meant to do. And that was the prelude to my awakening, actually, was chronic pain and disease. It was just my time to come into my gifts and to remember them. And by the way, as a young child, it's all there as well. So we've talked a lot about the third dimensional stuff and the business stuff. And, by the way, I was in marketing and did all of that stuff as well, which I use today in a very metaphysical way. But looking back at my childhood, there were definitely signs of channeling throughout my life that I never would have known that was what it was. And I had no adults around me to mirror that or to tell me that was what I was doing. But when I started doing it, when I had my awakening, which I think we'll talk about more in detail, I had these aha moments constantly when I would start to channel that would take me back to when I was 7 or 8 and having messages come in from various guides or beings or having two-way conversations in my head and all of these things. So the signs are always there, but I think together they're creating a roadmap or a container for that purpose to continually change and up level.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very evident in our two journeys, the differences, because if anything that you've seen of ours is written well, Micheila wrote it. And of course, she's written a book. And for me to write a book is a very tedious thing. So that's why it may not happen for a while. So if it's written well, she's the one who does a lot of the writing for us for the different things that we put out. But if it's visual design, I oversee that part. So because, and then you can see those differences in our life journeys and how our soul focused our interests in the areas that were necessary to the journey we came here to have. Because I was very much artistic as a child, although I did a little writing, it wasn't really my strength. Whereas Micheila is very drawn to writing, and it's a passion of hers. So those different things you can see evident in how we show up, and And in our relationship, it's a good complement because I can handle the visual design, she handles the writing, and so it works really well together that way. But I think again another element to touch on is how consciousness impacts the journey, because what you'll find is the consciousness level of the person will determine the kind of things that will express the container. So we talk a lot about containers as it pertains to cycles or astrology and numerology. And inside of a container, there are certain potentials, and any number of those potentials could be the same thing. Like, for example, being a conventional mainstream physician would be the same in kind of experience in a container as being some sort of a holistic health practitioner. So let's say you're an alternative doctor who is working in energy medicine and different kinds of holistic healing. The container could be the same thing as being a mainstream physician who prescribes pharmaceutical drugs and who is very conventional. What'll happen I find a lot of times is if a soul comes into an embodiment, into life, and they've at an early age brought up in a mainstream society, may choose the conventional path because that's what their family believes in. That's what society tells them they should do. So they go to college, get a degree, they become a doctor, they work in a hospital, and they do all the things that conventional doctors do. Then at some point in their life journey, with some individuals, they will have a consciousness shift. And that consciousness shift will be so significant that they look at their life that they created and they just can't do it anymore. I hear this a lot where doctors or people in the mainstream fields, especially in the medical field, will realize that they're causing harm to their patients, and the whole industry is doing that when they've been in that field all along, didn't even know that they were doing that. So when that occurs, when that consciousness change occurs, that person now has to change directions, and the container may still be the same. So the soul came to express what's in this container, but at a higher consciousness level, they may leave that conventional medical field behind and move more toward an alternative, holistic, higher vibrational express of the same thing that's in the container. And that may look like depending on the consciousness level, it could be anything from a conventional doctor who becomes a little less conventional. Maybe they're still a doctor, but maybe they're not following all of the mainstream principles, to somebody who has an extreme level of consciousness shift, and maybe they leave behind the entire medical space and become a holistic healer or energy healer or something in the far extreme of what that is. So in the context of the container of experience, it looks exactly the same, and the soul still has the same experience, but the experience is shifted to a higher level of consciousness, and as a result, it shows up in the world in a very different way. Another way I might say, if let's say my consciousness remained at the same level as when I was a child, or let's say it was at a very low level, I might have still ended up being in front of audiences throughout my life. And maybe, some of in my earlier, more mainstream life, I was very much involved in the financial space and teaching people how to invest and things of that nature. It could be that at this point in my life, I'm making YouTube videos in the finance space and talking about stocks and cryptocurrencies and these kind of things. Or I could have ended up in the marketing space and teaching and lecturing about those topics. The container may still be somewhat the same, but the consciousness level will determine in what way I express that in my life. And that's where I think consciousness has an impact. Have you noticed that at all with any of your experiences?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing about that is I have had more doctors as clients in the last couple of years than anything else. And many of them are shifting their focus. And I think it's important to note, so the example that you're giving is perfect for us to talk about having an intention before coming and then expressing that in a purposeful way through many dimensions, because our intention may be that we're here to leave behind a better potential physical body for all mankind, or to somehow upgrade human health so that future generations don't have to struggle with certain diseases. And we might have an experience of the very disease that we're here to heal first. And then we express in the third dimension as that medical doctor, which is more conventional, moving that up into the next dimension, the next dimension, the next dimension. And while there are so many who are awakening and having these conscious awakenings right now, I think one of the things that's really hard is we tend to look back on the decisions that we've made with so much regret because now we know so much more. And that can be a huge stumbling block. And even at times, for example, I've had people want to jump ship come to me and say, "Oh my gosh, I've had this major awakening and I can't do it anymore. I can't go to the hospital anymore and do this thing." And the guides say, you're anticipating this huge transition right now that you know you're going to make that isn't meant to happen overnight. So even if we find ourselves still in the same environment, there could be a reason that we're meant to be there. So that conscious awakening is somehow meant to be expressed as we walk our truth in an environment where others perhaps are ready to also awaken. And that's a part of our purpose. So we find ourselves in a very uncomfortable situation where we've awakened to things that we no longer want to do. And while we're preparing to move into a new way of doing it, we might still find ourselves there for a while. And instead of, kicking that to the curb and especially self-criticizing, we have to look at it all as divine timed and as service because it truly is.
Yeah, when I was younger, much younger, and even though I lived and I grew up in a family that was very mainstream, conventional Indian family, and I was born in India, so I was born and raised there for the first few years of my life. I came here with that sort of perspective and was raised in that environment. But even still, there was a spiritual thread that was always there that at a younger age I had no context for because my family was not really of that mindset. They were pretty much a Christian family. And so the spiritual perspectives I had, I really couldn't explore until I got into my late teens and 20s, where I became more interested in those things from a self-study perspective. Plus, I started attracting a lot of people into my life who were spiritually gifted in different areas. And so it exposed me to different ideas and concepts and spiritual phenomena that I'd never experienced when I was younger. And as a result, those things started opening up at a young age. And it wasn't something I was trying to do necessarily. Certainly had interest in those areas, but there were things that just came to me to experience because it was something that my soul chose to do. And even at a young age, looking back now, I didn't think anything of it back then, but when I was in my 20s, people actually came to me for spiritual advice and guidance and energy healing, and I didn't really know what I was doing or even that I knew anything. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I remembered and looked back and realized, oh, people always saw me in this context, even though I didn't see myself in this sort of context back at that young age. But it was always present. And there were other spiritual phenomena that were occurring around me, which again, I didn't have any point of reference, and I didn't have a lot of people in my life then who were advanced enough in their experience to be able to tell me what was going on. So many things like energy phenomena, telepathic experiences, and so on occurred in my 20s and 30s and beyond that. I've met a lot of channels when I was younger, and even some psychic mediums and people like that, and they were telling me things about my future, how I was supposed to be a spiritual teacher, and I'm sure many of you have heard those kind of things too from people you've gone to. And I didn't take it very seriously, of course, because I had no context or reference point. I wasn't raised in that kind of environment, and so I didn't really take it seriously. I just sort of filed it away as something that was fascinating to think about, but not anything that could happen to me. But as I got older, and I started studying astrology and numerology and looking at my own chart, I realized that that certainly was a potential that could happen in my life. So when those things started to unfold, it wasn't a surprise because I had had sort of inklings and nudges in that direction from a very young age. And so if that's happened to you, those things aren't happening by coincidence or randomly. They're happening because those are potentials that you put there, and certainly things you can step into. Now, there were interesting little phenomena, like I could charge batteries with my hands when I was in my 20s, and I thought it was just a coincidence, so I didn't really think much of it. There was another story, which I think I've shared before a long time ago in one of our events. I was in my early to mid 20s, actually. I was a handyman, which again, another thing that where I was fixing things. And so I was a handyman for about 6.5 years, and I worked in a property management apartment complex, which I know it seems like such a far leap from there to what I'm doing now. Um, but even there, the elements of what I would eventually do were there. And as an example, one particular story, there was a woman living there who I think it's too long ago to remember, but she was in her 70s or 80s. She was, in a little bit more advanced age, at least as we think of advanced age today, which I don't think that'll be the case in the future, but at that time. And I was just in her apartment repairing something. I don't recall what it was, but she was having this migraine headache, and she was complaining about this migraine headache, and she was somebody who really liked to talk, so she would talk the entire time I was there, and so she was saying, I have this migraine headache, and when I have these migraine headaches, sometimes I'm driving down the highway and I get a sudden migraine headache, and my vision goes completely white, and I can't see anything. So she goes completely blind while she's driving on the highway, and she said, I have to somehow get over to the shoulder of the road so I don't get in an accident. And I'm thinking, you know, that this person, picturing her doing this and thinking one of these days she's going to, get in an accident on the highway. And so at the time, I really didn't believe in my ability to do any kind of energy healing. It was just a kind of an inner knowing, but not really anything I had confidence about at the time. And she was a very mainstream person, didn't believe in any of this stuff. But she liked me well enough to trust me to just kind of humor what I was doing. And meanwhile, she could talk because was there longer. So I told her, just keep talking. Let me just stand behind you for a few minutes. So I just stood behind her, didn't touch her physically, but just had my hands behind her head for a period of time. And I told her, tell me what's going on with your headache. And so she was describing it. It was just all encompassing. And then over a period of time, it went down to like a little pinpoint, and then it vanished. And I, in my frame of mind thinking back then, I thought it was just a coincidence. I didn't really actually do anything. And so I finished up and I left and I went back to the office and went about my day. And the next morning, now this was in a time where we used pagers. We did not have mobile phones in our pockets, but so I had a pager, and anyone on the property could page me if there was an emergency, and she was paging me, and I didn't respond right away, and she started calling the office phone number, and she got through to the manager in the office, and she was just raving because not only was her headache gone, but she also, for many years, I think 7, 8 years, she had some very serious chronic illnesses. One of which was she couldn't lift her hands beyond her chest area, and so when she had to wash her hair, she couldn't do it in the bathtub because she couldn't lift her hand that high. And so she would tip her head underneath the kitchen sink to wash her hair. And for the first time in years, she could lift her hand above her head, which was very unusual. And and then her energy level returned. She could not walk without a cane for many years, or a walker. And all of a sudden, she could walk without a cane or a walker. And so for her, for being somebody who doesn't believe in any of this stuff, she she was shocked, but the only thing she could attribute it to was that I was there doing the energy thing that I did the day before. And so she asked me to keep coming back to do that, and I did. And for a period of about a month, I continued to come back until all of her pain had gone away, and she had even stopped taking a lot of her pharmaceutical drugs. She had a long list of drugs she was using, and slowly she started using less and less of them. This is one of the earliest phenomena where I had some confirmation that there was something unusual taking place, even though I had no reference point then. And I still, even after all that, thought it was probably a coincidence because it couldn't possibly have happened. So I had many instances of unusual experiences like that. I share a story of the first time I realized, at least was aware that I was doing some sort of energy thing, was when I met these two women in a spiritualist church, actually, in around, I think, 1997 or so. And I ended up realizing I had a telepathic connection with them where all three of us could communicate remotely and carry on conversations and things like that. And they were both, one was very sensitive to energy, the other one was a channel, and me, I didn't know it was anything. Um, but we went into this park this one time together, and the one that was very sensitive could see that somebody had committed suicide in that park before. And we looked it up later, and it turned out that was true. It was a true story, but none of us actually knew that when we went to the park. And and so I, doing the energy practice that I had started to develop back then, just tried to elevate the frequency of the whole park, thinking I'm just making stuff up, in my head, not really doing anything. And the one that was energy sensitive asked me, "Did you just do something?" And I said, "Why? What do you see?" She said, "Well, whole park lit up." So things like that were happening at a very young age, and but again, I didn't have enough people around me to tell me what was going on. And now I could go back to my younger self and say, "Oh, this is what happened." And this is some of the early things that were going on. Now, in my 30s and 40s, even though the spiritual thread was always there, I went into more mainstream fields of work. Ran the marketing, branding agency for many years, and also started working in the financial space, teaching people how to invest in the markets and things like that. So very mainstream stuff. And this is prior to meeting Micheila. And at the time, I was in a different relationship even. It was a much more conventional relationship. Although the elements that weren't conventional were we were both interested in spirituality, and we went to classes and traveled to see Esther Hicks at the time. And I read up on all those kind of books, and we were also into the raw food vegetarian space pretty heavily at that time as well. So the health component also was present at that time. Now, at the very end, just to show how you can change timelines based on your consciousness. When we were a few years into the relationship, I could see that in 5 years that relationship was going to end, even though the two of us talked about it and we discussed how, well, we're never going to break up the relationship. Yet in 5 years exactly it happened. But coinciding with that breakup was I had a shift in consciousness. And that shift in consciousness suddenly made it so that it wasn't so much that we were breaking up as much as the vibration or the consciousness of the two of us had become so different, or was becoming so different, that we were sort of repelling each other. She was going into a more mainstream direction, and suddenly I was leaving that behind. And so this was around 2010 to 2011, and I hadn't met Micheila at that time. And I suddenly, over the course of a couple to few years, the business that I was running completely fell apart, and our relationship broke up. The business fell apart. I had an office with people working there and everything. I had to downsize, and I had to shut down the office, bring all the furniture, put it into storage. And suddenly, the financial work that I was doing stopped making sense, and I just couldn't go back to it. I reached a point where I would rather be homeless and broke than to go back into the financial space. And so this is where I found myself in 2010, 11, and 12, just before I met Micheila. And so I went from being very successful in what most people would consider successful in a mainstream space to suddenly losing everything and having to start my life over as my consciousness shifted. And I realized with that consciousness shift that I had to go into an alternative direction, even though I had no idea what that was going to be. So what I realized was I can't go back to that former life because at the new consciousness level that I had reached, I couldn't find myself doing that work anymore. It just did not make sense with who I was becoming. But at the same time, I was at a big cycle shift in my astrology numerology cycle. So where I was going was a totally different direction, but it had not formulated yet. So I was in this in-between place where the old stuff no longer made sense or it fell apart, and the new was so new I had no idea where it was going. I just knew it was different. And so in faith, I decided that I was going to go in this new direction, even though I had no reference point for where it was going and no one to guide me as to whether it made any sense or not. So I went from somebody who had, was very successful, financially well off, and had nice things, to suddenly I was on the verge of homelessness, to where I had no car, almost no money, and at any moment would be homeless, and I had to walk places to get groceries, and I didn't even have money for groceries. In fact, that was around the tail end of that was when I met Micheila, or actually sort of in the middle of that, because when we first met and she joined the team, I had just started Flower of Life, and we're planning our first expo with no money. It was just in faith that I'm going in the right direction. I have no idea how I'm going to accomplish this with no money when I can't even afford groceries. And so when she joined the team, she started leaving groceries at my front door because she thought I was going to starve to death. And um, fortunately, I can function on very little food, so it was okay. But still, though, that was where I found myself, was at any moment I could be homeless. My power could be cut off. And I think actually I did have some problems back then with, I don't remember if it was power. But anyhow, I was at that precarious place where in faith, I was going in a new direction. I had no money. I was completely broke. I lost everything, lost the relationship, lost the business, having to, in faith, go in a new direction because of a consciousness change, and trying to do big things like a conference at a big convention center in downtown Detroit when I had never done anything of that scale. And but I did it anyway. I went forward not knowing. And of course, the first several expos lost money when I didn't have money to lose. And I still went forward anyway. And so that's what can happen when you have a consciousness shift and suddenly you can't go back because who you are now doesn't resonate with that. But you have to go forward even though you don't know if there's going to be a safety net there to save you when you go in this new direction. The thing is, life always works out. And you have to take those inclinations, those chances. And even though you may not know how you're going to get there. And it took many years to go from being completely broke to being stable again financially, to not having to worry about money, to then being successful again, but now in this new life direction with a more spiritually based foundation. And now in hindsight, I would never look back. I would never have, I would have done everything the same way I would have done. The only thing I might have done differently is not worried so much about how it was all going to turn out or how the pieces were going to come together. Because even in the first few years, doing an expo that cost $50,000-$60,000 and having no money, and not selling enough tickets to actually cover the cost for many years was a very uncertain, difficult period. But the funny thing is, things just kind of worked out. And even though I didn't have the money, the universe supported these things getting done. And that's a thing we have to keep in mind is when we go forward in faith and try different things that are in alignment, and that's a key point there. If the path I was going on was misguided or not in alignment with my soul's purpose in this life, then those things wouldn't have been supported and the expos would have failed and I wouldn't have been able to keep going forward and get to where I am. And that's where you have to pay attention to those cues and get into alignment with your soul's purpose in the first place. When you do that, then everything will work out, even though it may not work out the way you think. Like for me, the way I thought back then was, well, if it works out, that means that if I do this conference, it people will come, there'll be money to pay all the expenses, and I'll be able to do the next one and the next one and the next one. The reality is every single one lost money, and I just found some way to make it work, or the universe just orchestrated things so that it worked out, even though there was no rational reason for me to expect that it would have. And that's what alignment is about, is when you get into that alignment, your soul's journey is orchestrated automatically. And it may not look like you think. You know, for me, having the monetary confidence after every conference to say, oh, it worked out the way I thought it was going to, is not how it was supposed to work out. And that's what we have to do in those situations to have that faith to go forward. And of course, I've had many cycle changes since then, and each time it slightly shifts the direction I'm going in the work that I'm doing. And there's certainly many more stories I could share, but I'll stop there for now, and Micheila can share some of how she got to where she is.
Well, before I do, I want to touch on the energy transfer because I think that's the key, that's the foundation upon which all of those other things were built. And one of the things that I know about your story that you didn't bring up that's similar to mine, and this involves Barb Morey, for those of you who are out there who know Barb, is that she confirmed in you something that no one ever had, which led you to do these energy transfers, which sent you into a state of bliss. And that from that state of bliss, everything else was born, right? And what the guides say is that whatever we've achieved in any of our past lifetimes, we don't lose that when we come here. So if there's some spiritual practice or gift or modality, we reincarnate with it as a possibility in this life to blossom into something unique to this timeline. So unlike Ethann, I didn't have all of those spiritual influences surrounding me very early in life. In fact, I had none whatsoever. I went a totally conventional path. I was raised Catholic. I went to college, got the journalism degree. I ended up in marketing, and then got married and had kids. Had a really successful career in marketing and left it behind to be a stay-at-home mom, which I never thought that I would do. But chronic pain became the facilitator of my spiritual awakening and remembrance of something that I have done in many past lifetimes. And I don't think there's any way I could have taken a class just out of pure interest and learned what I know how to do. It just spontaneously came through me when I started to meditate. And by the way, I didn't start meditating for any other reason other than to heal my pain, because I was taught that meditation could lower my stress level, lower my pain levels. I had no spiritual conquest going on whatsoever, nor did I even know what that meant. But in the first breath session that I did, which by the way was not instructed by anyone, I didn't follow anyone else's method, I just started to breathe. I fell into this very deep connection and I began hearing things, not only in meditation, but throughout my entire day. So I was walking through the grocery store and having just a basic conversation with the guy behind the deli counter and hearing things from his guides and my guides about his life and things like that. And I was going home and scratching my head and thinking I was going crazy. But this gift within me from multiple lifetimes before, it rose up at the right time when my life was meant to take a turn because it was seen in my astrology chart in the same way that you just explained your own. Because shortly after meeting Ethan, I came to him for an astrology session and it was all there. So my life imploded in a huge way, slightly different than yours, but the relationship, the marriage ended. There was a huge shift in consciousness there that just wasn't sustainable any longer. And I don't think that that marriage could have come along with me on the path that I'm on today. It just wasn't meant to remain in my life. And gosh, everything else. I mean, I am like a completely different person today than I was back then. So I could look back and say, well, none of that was meant to be. I shouldn't have gotten married or I shouldn't have done the things I did. But we're working through this very thick layer of density. And I think part of the problem is we don't trust or believe in the gifts and abilities that we have because we have been suppressed for so long in our own self-worth and our own intuition. And that's what's really springing up these days, I think, is people are having these huge spontaneous upgrades in their spiritual gifts, even after being in this arena for a very long period of time. So we talked about, I think it was the last channeling episode, sacred coupling. And I love that example because
Actually, it was a few ago.
it was a few ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a few ago. I love that show because it's a great example as to what happens to your life in all areas. I think when you choose to walk the path of that spiritual awakening or that raise in consciousness, the right people come in at the right time with the right information and the right resources to help you get started. And if I had never met Ethan, believe me, I would not be on this path today because he was very adamant that, as a matter of fact, it's a funny story. I was on the team and we had a channel for the first expo. And she bowed out at the last minute. And he looked at me and said, it was always meant to be you. And I never would have gotten up on stage. I was, doing this in my closet behind closed doors, had no aspiration of doing this, for people one-on-one. But had I not had the people around me and, that support around me, like Barb, for example, and the team, I would have never, taken that risk. And not all of us have that. I think we do go through periods of transition where we are alone and we're meant to be alone because we're building up that inner confidence and we're coming to conclusions about, what are our gifts and abilities and how do they work? And we get to define that however we want, which I think is very rare in this day and age because even a word like channel is so abstract. Everyone's a channel, I think, personally, on planet Earth. But how we channel and what we're here to do with the channeling, no one else has the same mirror reflection of that. We are all a very unique piece of the puzzle here to do something that attributes to the whole. So taking that path is like walking on, the path less traveled. It's the journey you never thought or never believed you would take, but it's just in a synchronistic way, all falling together. And even for me, that included my health. I, in this awakening, had some initial messages come in from a guy named Jacob, who I later found out was a past life connection to me. He identified himself as a gatekeeper, who is a very special guide who opens the door to many others. And he sent me down a very incredible and synchronistic path of meeting the people and doing the things that I needed to do to get better. And even looking back on that path, it's just very miraculous and very mystical to me that I would have even done the things that I did or gone the direction that I had because these were things that were not on my radar whatsoever. And that's what I see today is I have people in session who are awakening to a specific gift. And maybe we can talk about some of the roadblocks or, the mistakes that people make. The guides always say that when we awaken to a gift, and whether that's clairaudience, clairsentience, you're doing energy healing, whatever it is, automatically, like a magnet, you're going to draw in a mirror reflection of who you're meant to be. So that often comes in the way of a teacher. And we are motivated or excited to take a class. And I did that actually well after I was channeling, just because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I decided to take a channeling class. And we think we have to follow those directions. So we get this very rigid and linear instruction manual of how to channel and what channeling is and how to do protection and all of these things. But there was always a part of me that knew different than what I was being taught. Even though there were some valuable experiences and things that were going on, there was a part of me that wanted to always add to that or had a new like perspective, let's say, of what was being taught. And so I think one of the big mistakes that people make that the guides point out is that they either stay in the class too long after they've already gotten everything they need, or they step out of bounds of what they're naturally here to do and what that organic gift is and start doing it the way someone else recommends. And not only will that diminish the worth of what you bring to the planet, I personally think it gets you off path, because the second you get in the mindset that you have to do something a certain way in order to succeed, you've just limited that access to resource that you're talking about, that takes you from this reality that's falling apart to one that's coming back together. And it does take a lot of faith, but for me, it also took letting go, knowing when to let go of the things that felt so safe and secure, but were no longer working for me anymore, or meant to go with me on the journey ahead.
Yeah, there are a lot of things there I want to touch on, but starting with how you said that we meet, we tend to meet the people at the right time and so on. And I think timing is a key element here, because just relating back to what Micheila was saying about meeting Barb at that time, actually, when I was so if you use even just simple numerology as a means to understand where you are in your cycles, I was at the very end of my previous 9-year cycle when my business was falling apart, the relationship was breaking up, and I went through this period of uncertainty. And the 9-year of the 9-year cycle until the 4-year of the next 9-year cycle is a period where you're going through transition, where the previous thing that you were doing and life direction you were going falls apart. And a lot of times I find consciousness shifts occur in that 9th year, 9 through 1 year. And you're starting the new thing in the 1 through 3 year and building that. But it's also a period where you don't really know where it's going. It was in my 9 through 1 year that I had the initial consciousness shift. At that point, I had not met Micheila and Barb. I actually met Barb in my 1 through 2 year, I believe, and then I met Micheila in my 2 through 3 year, and so basically the consciousness shift led to meeting the two of them, and then though they ended up playing key roles in my life and still do to this day. So the timing of these things tends to work that way, where your previous life falls apart, you start something new, and then you meet all the right people you need to, usually in those first few years. And many of them will stay and play a long-term role in your life. And some will fall away, of course. But um, and so you'll see that timing. And I think that timing is important to keep in mind when you're sort of charting or navigating how to execute. And I think we should talk a bit more in a minute about the practical parts of this and how to execute this. Because if you try to move too fast in a time when your cycles are just beginning, you may find that it moves too slow, or it gets stifled, or the things you do don't work out. Whereas if you move fast when the cycles are accelerating, you'll find that the things you're doing move a lot quicker. Like Micheila was a little bit farther along in her cycles when I met her. And so her channeling really went from she wasn't doing it at all to suddenly she's on stage in front of a big audience at the last minute. And it just grew very quickly because her cycles were more advanced, where I lagged behind her by a couple of years before things started turning around for me in that direction as well. So the first few years, as I was saying earlier, with the expos, not doing well financially, and I was struggling on a personal level financially as well. Um, those were those beginning years, the 9-year cycle. But when I got to the fourth year, things started picking up, and the the repercussions, or rather the growth that from the seeds I had been planting in the previous year, started to show. Whereas Micheila was already in her fourth year, I believe. Yeah, I met you as you were in your third year, going into your fourth, and it was in the fourth year that she was in front of an audience for her first time as a channel. So so you can kind of see that if you follow your own cycles. And then from that perspective, when you're trying to envision, how do I take this sole purpose and execute it in a physical reality, that should be done with an awareness of the timing, the proper timing to do certain things. Because if you try to do things prematurely, you may find it doesn't work out. And I have encountered that with a lot of people over the years that I've worked with as light workers, as an example. If they, depending on where they are in the cycle, will determine the kind of things we should be working on at that time. If they're very beginning in the cycle, the expectation should be there that it may not move as quickly as you want, but if you set all the pieces in motion, by the time the growth years of the cycle happen, everything that you did will pay off at that time. So you, at certain points, have to be patient. At other points, you have to be willing to put in the time and effort and work harder. And at other times, you have to be willing to let it fall apart so that you can reinvent yourself. And that's where I think that's really important. And the right people come at those times to direct you. And as Micheila was saying, I met Barb first, actually, of the two of them, and then I think I met you about 6 months or something later. But very close together in terms of timing. And Barb came to one of my then events, which was a raw food potluck that I was running, which was a fragment of my previous life that was still there at the moment. And her comment to be about my energy field, although people had been telling me my whole life that I was going to be a spiritual teacher and there was something unusual going on, I really didn't take it that seriously until I met Barb. So that again speaks to the proper timing. At a certain point in life, if the consciousness shift occurs and the right people at that time show up and tell you, oh, this is what it is, you, at that point, the timing is right and you are in the right place in terms of your consciousness level to match that timing, and that results in you going in that new direction. And that's what happened. I had no reason to believe Barb except that she had been seeing auras her whole life. So I thought, if that's true, of course, being a rational, left-brained, intellectual person, I put her through a lot of tests. I had her look at the auras of different things that I could verify or validate, things that she didn't know anything about, to see, was she picking up on the auras the way that I thought it should look. And so when I had enough confidence that she was, she really did have the ability that she claimed she had, then I trusted that she must be seeing in me what she said she was. And so as a result, I decided to start experimenting in groups with the energy transfer. And that's what led to initially what was just a monthly experiment for my own personal validation that something was actually happening. And after a year, 2 years of doing that and seeing the confirmation, I had started getting more confidence that there really was something going on. And of course, it led to other things. So I think timing and all of that is an important consideration when it comes to someone coming into your life and telling you those things. Because someone may come into your life and tell you those things, and you may not be at the consciousness level or the proper cycles in terms of the timing to actually do something with it yet. But at a later point in life, you may be. So I think that's important. And I don't know if you want to start talking about the more practical parts or something else.
Yeah, I want to play off a couple of points you make. I think first the test phase is it's always a part of that awakening if you're willing to take the risk. So for me, I was channeling just for friends and people that I knew, but then all of a sudden my friends were inviting their friends into the circle that I didn't know, which was a pretty scary thing. But I think that's always purposeful, because what I found was I was channeling things about them or for them that there's no way I could have known, and that takes a huge level of vulnerability. So I think always in that spiritual awakening or that movement and readiness towards the gift, there's a test phase. But interestingly, one of the things guides talk about in my sessions for people who want to make the leap from a spiritual gift into a spiritual quote unquote business is the idea of open source. So what you were doing with the energy transfers, just offering them for free to see what happened, is an open source model. It's putting something out there that could be helpful for people with no expectation other than some feedback as to what they felt or how their experience was. And that's great in many different ways, because you get to assemble the language and write the whole description of what your service is through the eyes of others, and get that validation that something truly is going on. But interestingly, the fifth dimension operates in open source. So when we're jumping timelines from a more conventional type of business, for example, into a more spiritual business model, we think we have to put in 8 hours and we have to do the same kind of work and the same kind of schedule and format that we did before. But that trips us up big time, because if we open source something, which means no expectation, we're providing our service to the world, what will happen is phenomenal, because it will open up avenues for your work to receive financial abundance and resource that you may have not expected, while also leaning into creativity and finding fulfillment and joy in the service. And that's another, I think, mistake that the guides point out that people make, is we feel this burden or responsibility. I have this purpose and this service, and if I don't get it done before the end of my incarnation, and I don't know what it is and I don't get it right, I'm going to fail. But what the guides say is, remember, it's an intention. You came here with this overarching intention, these very specific gifts and abilities that have carried with you through multiple lives, and you're bridging the gap between the two by bringing joy and creativity to it. So what excites you about putting this out in the world, and where can you add those very unique things that you've learned along the way, which were obviously purposeful, to really make it something incredible?
Yeah, I want to a lot of interesting things here I want to touch on, but you're talking about how I did the energy transfers in faith, not really expecting any reward, and I think a lot of people get hung up on the financial aspect. They expect to go out there and do something and immediately make money, and the universe will give you whatever you need. But I think, to set in context what you're saying about me doing that in faith, that was at a time in my life where I had no money. I had no money. I had no car. I could barely afford groceries, and I had to count on Micheila or Barb or somebody else who was on the team at the time to actually pick me up and drive me to these energy transfer events that we were doing for free. And so, and there was even a time during that period of time when I couldn't get a ride. So I had, I was dressed nice in my shirt and pants, and I had to walk 3 miles in the hot summer to a public library that actually kicked us out a few months later because we were, I don't know, they thought we were doing weird things
Too
there.
crazy.
Too crazy. Too is too. I mean, it's a public library that's supposed to allow members to rent the rooms for free, but we were not allowed to rent rooms there anymore. So I had all these obstacles to deal with, right? And so I'm walking to this event to do a free event, not expecting to get paid. We were not charging donations or anything at that time, so it was just to do it. And sometimes you have to do those kind of things. And another thing Micheila is talking about that I think is really key, and it's also true for me, in that in those early years doing those events, I was just doing them to experiment and to get practice and to understand what I was doing, because there was no instruction manual for me for what I was doing. I was just making it up as I went along based on my own inner knowing of what I was doing. And that I had been doing my whole adult life and even from childhood, and I just didn't know that I had been doing it at that time. And that is that in Micheila's case, she was channeling for friends, and of course, my role in her life was to put her in front of audiences and make her do that. And I think a lot of people, that's the thing they don't do. Uh, I've worked with a lot of light workers over the years who are class junkies. They've learned 1,000 different modalities, and they're scheduled for 6 other classes that are coming up, and they're trying to learn all these different things so they can go out into the world and practice these 10 different things they've learned from other people. And I think some people do that because they don't have the confidence or belief in themselves. Other people, they think they don't really know what to do, so they are trying all these different things, hoping and oftentimes doing one of those modalities as a service or whatever they decide to do or contribute in the world. I think that is, I think it's fine to take classes. I think it's great to learn from other people. I'm constantly learning from other people. But when you use what you're learning as a crutch, then I think it gets in the way of you expressing your soul's purpose. Because, for example, if you learned Reiki, let's say, and you went out there and started practicing Reiki in the same way that you were taught, I think that's a mistake because, in my opinion, the only person who should have practiced Reiki is the person who discovered Reiki. And now I think as Reiki is sort of like a gateway drug, you might say, to the spiritual field or the spiritual healing field in particular, because almost everybody starts at Reiki before they start doing other things. And it's become very mainstream these days. So I think it serves that role, and that's great. But you should never get stuck at Reiki and becoming a Reiki practitioner because you're a unique expression of consciousness. And if you are here to do something different from everybody else, then it certainly can't be something you learn from somebody else. So when I've worked with light workers in the past, the first thing I do after we talk about their life and what they've done with themselves is I have them start practicing on other people immediately. And so about 6 months of the time I've worked with people in the past is minimum 6 months is they are practicing on other people. And my one and only rule is that they're not allowed to use anything they've learned from anybody else. And so after they have their initial meltdown, because nobody, for the most part, the majority of people have no idea who they are when they peel away everything they've learned. And so quite often, a lot of people struggle with that idea because, well, they want to do Reiki, they want to do all these other things they've learned, but they're not allowed to use those things. And because underneath the surface of all those things you've learned, you'll find that there is something at the core of who you are that has been there from birth. And you need to get to that thing. And that is what you're here to express in the world. And that is what you will make the biggest contribution to society and help the most people. And also gain the most resources for yourself, whether that be you're living in a society that requires money, or whether that be something else, depending on what you need in the world that you live in. So, on the other hand, if you do what everybody else does, let's say Reiki as a modality, then you're not going to help people in a way that's unique to you because nobody should be doing Reiki as a practice, as something to learn and explore, yes, but as a practice to help other people, nobody should be doing Reiki, except for the person who originally discovered it. So if you're doing that, then you're not really following your unique purpose. Now, maybe you studied Reiki and you're doing something a little bit different now than Reiki, but Reiki was sort of a launching point. And maybe there you incorporate some of that pieces of what you learned, but what you're doing is totally different, then that may be okay. but you really want to get yourself in the direction of doing something that's unique to you that no one else on the planet is doing, because no one else on the planet is you. And so you want to move in that direction. And part of that is looking over your life and seeing what things you've been drawn to or unique talents and interests. And then also looking beneath the surface of the other modalities you've been doing. So let's say you've studied 10 different modalities, and uh, and in all of them, what makes it different is that you're doing it in this one unique way that they really didn't teach you in the modality, but you just kind of gravitated that. What you want to do is peel away all this surface stuff and look at what is underneath the surface. What is it that you're doing that's special and unique? And you want to bring that out to the surface and get rid of everything else. And that thing, whatever it is or at least it's a seed of what your unique expression and purpose is in this life. And that needs to be cultivated. And then the next thing to do is to, in faith, just like both of us, um, go out and practice it. Even if you have no idea what you're doing and you think you're a phony and you think you're making stuff up, do it anyway and collect the feedback and the confidence and the experience in doing that thing. And eventually that will pick up in the momentum and head you in the right direction. But if at this point in your life you're not doing something that you can confidently say only you can possibly do that thing that you're doing, then you're not yet expressing your unique soul purpose. Maybe you're expressing some part of it, but you need to get to that point where what you're doing is that unique and special, and you can identify that and you can explain to somebody else why what you're doing is unique, or it is very obvious in the doing of it that what you're doing is unique. So those are some things I wanted to say, and certainly we can get into some of the mechanics of it, but I think that's important in your journey as well, and how you're practicing with friends in the beginning. And I think that's a key thing, is you have to practice that talent and let it develop.
I think it's hard for us to go from a civilization, a society that has been taught we all need to be the same and follow the leaders, to a place that the guides say, you know, you're here to offer the world something that no one's ever seen before, because we're not taught that, and it's a huge leap, and there's so much resistance because we don't trust ourselves. But I think what you're talking about here, especially with the Reiki example, it really leans into the financial abundance, because if we truly come with an entire, you know, vault of financial abundance and resources that we need to do what we're here to do, and we diminish that in worth to what other people do, that's why we aren't going to succeed in that area. And of course, we all have our karmic experiences and lessons we need to learn and evolve through. And there are going to be times when those things are not available to us in the amounts that we believe. But what I have found is it's far easier if you stay in that lane, which we've been talking about, which to me is intention. So I always keep going back in this conversation to the intention, because that's what the guides say. We didn't have a purpose for coming, we had an intention. So if we bring that down to earth in a spiritual business model, we really have to think about, what is our mission here? What's our intention? Even if that's going to change, which we both know it will, because the earth is changing so rapidly. And I meet people in session all of the time who say, I've been in this world for 15, 20 years, which is way longer than me. And I've been doing this for so long, and now it's all crumbling apart. It doesn't make sense anymore. And the guides will step in and say, well, that's because it's got to up level, because humans are ready for a new version of what you are doing. And a lot of this is collective. So people have been doing those one-on-one sessions, for example, and the guides will come in and say, well, you know, the energy that you're working with is quantum. So we're at a time of mass awakening. We need to gather more people and do these things, knowing they can all have an individual result. And that's just one example. But it also suggests that if we're working with more people, we're also supporting ourselves better. We're making a huger impact. And these are really difficult beliefs for us to hold, that we can actually do that much good and serve. And there's always that stigma, right? People who are kind-hearted and who awaken spiritually have a hard time charging money for their spiritual gifts because it just doesn't seem to jive. But what I've experienced is that when everything in my life is taken care of, I have more to give freely. So it really circles back around to that open source model, which for me has always been the cornerstone of my work. The more I'm able to do that, the more that comes back, the more I'm able to do without expectation. And I think that's a key reminder, for everyone in this time when we assume we want to move into a period of unity consciousness and equilibrium across the board where, everyone's able to afford and make the same amount of money. But we're all here to do different things and reach different audiences in different geographic regions and, need certain things to do that. So it's going to be different, I think, across the board.
Hmm. Yeah, I want to talk about the money and some of the practical elements now. Um, and I'm going to upset a few people with my conversation about this. Now, just to backtrack for those of you who are not familiar with my story, I grew up in a very mainstream world and mainstream household. Money was highly valued in that upbringing. And I went a very unconventional direction in my life, being very entrepreneurial and in my early years, setting goals and striving for wealth and money and things like that. And so I learned a lot from being on that side of things, having a very mainstream, success-oriented mindset and a very achievement-oriented person from a very young age, to where I've come to to more of a holistic spiritual perspective. So when I talk about money and resources, it's from the context of somebody who's walked all of that range of experience from very mainstream grounded perspective to also a spiritual perspective as well. Now, when I use the term money in this conversation, I'm referring very broadly to resources in general because um, not everybody lives in a society or has a life where money is necessary. If you're here to sit on a mountaintop and be a guru and teach people spiritual principles, and people bring you food, and that's all you need, maybe you don't need money. But for most of us, especially those of you who may be watching a stream like this or a video like this or a podcast, depending on where you're listening, you probably need money in the life that you're living in. But we all need different amounts. So, what for me is a bare minimum, for you maybe a lot, or vice versa. So it varies from person to person what money means. But in my years of business and also so having personal experience with money and charging different amounts in mainstream as well as spiritually based things, I have a very unique perspective on this topic. And first of all, I want to set sort of and we've talked about money and touched on it in almost every one of our podcasts because I think it's a really important topic because we live in a world which unfortunately has money is a controlled system that is used to enslave humanity and to keep us living very small lives. I don't think that's necessary though, because ultimately money is just a way that source expresses itself in this reality. And unfortunately, it's controlled and limited, and that's what makes it a bad thing. So in the spiritual space, I think a lot of times we think of money, or even growing up, may believe that money is evil, or money doesn't grow on trees, all these very limiting beliefs that we're taught growing up, or that if you have money, you're greedy. And some of these may be well intentioned by family members who are speaking these things, but I think on a more broad scale, I think there are intentions there to teach people these these ideas to keep us from not having very much money. So the very few can control the world. But one thing that I want everyone to understand is that the amount of money or resources you have has nothing to do with anyone else. So if you charge money for making something, piece of artwork, or you charge money for a service, whether you're a physician or you're a Reiki healer, that money that's being paid to you by that other person has nothing to do with that other person. That even though we can say in a very grounded, practical perspective, if you charge $100 for something and that other person handed that $100 to you, physically, that $100 is no longer in their hands and in their bank account, it's now in yours, and therefore it exchanged hands. They have less and you have more. And you might say that that's the case, but the reality is that the money that came by way of another person did not actually come from that other person. It is simply source expressing itself through that person as as a way to facilitate that exchange. But ultimately, it's not that other person. It is the universe expressing itself through them. So when that money comes to you from that other person, it doesn't really come to you from that other person. It comes to you by way of them. So how much you charge for something, whether you charge very little, and I know a lot of people in the spiritual space especially, but this is not just in the spiritual space. I think this is just humanity in general. When people are self-employed, as an example, they tend to have a hard time with charging money for things. And what you need to understand is the amount you charge for something, whether it's too little or too much, is more a reflection of your own sense of self-worth and your own belief in how much you are worth in between you and source. So if I charge $100 or I charge $400 for something, and somebody pays me that, it is no reflection on them and their wealth or monetary resource is between them and source. So let's say I charge $400 for something that everybody else charges $100 for, and people pay me the $400 for it. That person who paid me the $400, for them, it may be nothing, or for them, it may be a lot. But regardless of what it is for them, their relationship with their source is what determines their flow. So let's say one person pays me $400 and for them it's nothing because they have so much wealth. And the other person, that $400 is really difficult and they had to save for months to pay it. That difference has nothing to do with me, because the one person who has an incredible amount of abundance has a better relationship with their source in that area where the other person does not. And it is not something that I will change by charging less. So if somebody says you charge too much and you lower your price, you have not affected their abundance whatsoever. And in many ways, you have reinforced their ability to stay right where they are. And meanwhile, you have just reduced yours. And you're basically saying to source, I can take less, I need less. And if you do, and that amount of money is plenty for you in the life that you're living, then that's great. It doesn't really matter. But if you could be living a bigger life and doing more, then you should be charging more. So, but again, the service or product you're offering has to be worth that too. So you can't just simply charge more and be doing the same thing that somebody else is doing. And this is what gets back to my earlier comment about if you're offering something that is unique to you, you're following your soul's purpose, then you can charge more because what you're doing is special. And it's something that only you can do. But if you're doing something that everybody else is doing, then you can't really charge more for it because you're a commodity. And I often use the example of if you're buying an orange, for example, and two stores are selling oranges because it's a commodity. Everybody sells oranges. Every grocery store has them. then at that point, you're just looking for the lowest price orange because it doesn't really matter. They're all oranges. And that's what a lot of people do when they go into businesses. They sell an orange that everybody else is selling instead of trying to figure out what they can do that's unique and special that other people can't do. And doing that thing, at that point, they're selling something that is a totally different fruit that doesn't even exist on the planet except for what they're providing. And when you're providing something that is completely different, that nobody else on the planet can provide, you can charge whatever you want for it, as long as what you're doing is beneficial and people see the value in what you're doing. I often use the examples of different luxury brands, for example, and people will spend a ridiculous amount of money on a purse, for example, or shoes. I would never do that because I don't value that thing. But there are people who do value that thing. And when you value something and it's unique and special and one of a kind, there are always going to be people who are willing to pay for that thing because they value it. And another thing that's important to remember, and I learned this in all my years of business, and that is the lower, and I know this is going to, a lot of people are going to disagree with this, but I, from personal experience, found this to be true, and I've read this in many books about the psychology of money and scarcity and things like that. So I not only have the research and reading experience, but personal experience, and that is in businesses that I own throughout my life, I found that when I charged the least amount of money, I always had clients who were dissatisfied and who were more difficult to work with. And they complained about the money being too much, even though I was charging so little. When I found that in the very same field of work, was at the opposite extreme, where I was charging the most for whatever I was offering, I had the most happy clients. They were very pleased. They were extremely easy to work with, and I never questioned the cost. So now, maybe if you're charging the most in the field, and this is certainly true in businesses I've owned in the past, in the mainstream and in the spiritual spaces, and that is when you get to the higher price points, you're not going to be working with the people who could not afford those price points. But again, as I said, the amount of money you make is your relationship with source. It has more to do with your own self-worth than it has to do with the other person who is handing you the money. So that's a really important point to keep in mind because I think many of us feel guilty when we charge more for something or feel like, well, it's a spiritual thing, we shouldn't charge for it. But those two ideas are totally incongruent because they're not related. The amount of money you charge is not related to the service you offer. The amount of money you charge is simply source providing you with resources so that you can live the life you came here to live. Totally separate from whatever work you're doing in the world. And if you are always telling source, no, I don't want this money, I'm going to charge less, that's fine, but you may not live to the potential because, as Micheila said, as an example, if we didn't charge what we do for what we do, then we wouldn't be able to have the studio as an example. And so the studio costs a lot of money and a lot of time, and even all the technology, which none of you see, was very expensive to put together and make it all work a certain way. And now, if we charge a lot less, then we would not have been able to do those things. And this is where the universe is willing to provide you with the resources to live your life to its fullest potential. But if you have a hard time accepting that abundance and that self-worth, what you're actually worth, then you may still do the work that you came here to do, but not to the potential of what you can do because you won't have the resources to do it. So that's where, it's just some of the ideas about money that I think are really important to keep in mind when you're navigating this space and moving into something where you're expressing your own unique purpose out in the world.
Yeah, I want to take this to a more multi-dimensional perspective as opposed to material just for a second, because if we are becoming multidimensional beings, that means that we're working with more energy and we're playing with more options. So I think where the open source is brilliant is we get to give the entire world access to something very special that we have to offer. So for us, it's the podcast. We do live events free of charge with no expectation. And we are able to do that to reach those people who could never afford to pay for a service that requires more of our energy. And I think that's another difference in terms of a more conventional business model versus moving into the fifth dimension and a spiritual type of purpose is that we neglect to value our energy. We are used to valuing our time and what we do. And this is a lesson I learned very early on is, as a channel, I can't do 8, 9 sessions a day. And believe me, I tried, but running the way that I run energy in order to do something that big for one individual, it's a lot. So over the years, I've had to back off the number and up the price. And that's become one of the more expensive areas of my service. But the brilliant thing about multidimensionality and creativity in a spiritual purpose is that you get to price things at various levels based on your energy and your input. And so for me, working with a group, for example, or filming a video for a subscription is very affordable for those who might not be able to do a session who still get to work with the guides. Courses, workshops, all of these things. And I love that, even the book, right? So my work gets to express through all of these different things. It isn't this one linear thing. And those things are all priced differently because they require different levels of energy and output and are received by different numbers of people. And that's making a huge, I feel purposely, it's making a huge impact in fulfilling my purpose and having a purpose on the planet. So it's a different way of thinking, I believe, than what we're used to. And that's another thing we have to consider is when we're looking out at the world today and social media and the coaching and the branding and all of that stuff, we can really fall into the trap of having to do things a certain way to gain followers or get approval, make money. And none of those things are necessary. When you have a spiritual gift that no one else has, and you offer it with no expectation, the invitations to work with it more are going to come. It's the way the universe works. We are supporting others, and then the universe is supporting us. And then we have more energy to work with to use that support in really, really creative ways. So I think no matter how you slice it, moving between dimensions is tough.
Yeah.
We're going to face resistance within ourselves, within the world, within family members, because it's something very unknown and completely different.
Yeah, I do want to touch on that in a more grounded, practical. I'm the grounded, practical side of this show because that's just the way I think. And what Micheila is saying is very important because, and I want to relate it to what I see a lot of people in the spiritual space and how they structure their businesses. There are two ways of doing things. One, you could be, and let me just use Reiki as an example. So let's just say you're practicing Reiki and that's your business. And so you're doing something that's a commodity. And because of that, you charge a low price point because there's a Reiki master on every corner. So you can't charge a premium price because they can go to that next corner and get the same service that you're offering, at least what you say you're offering, because a lot of people who are saying they're practicing Reiki are actually doing something that's probably a little bit different, unique to them, but they're still calling it Reiki. So as far as the public is concerned, it's the same thing. So one way you could structure your living your life purpose is to do something that's a commodity and charge a low price point, and then you would be doing 10 sessions a day or however many you can possibly do, and you're barely getting by at the end of the week. So I see the vast majority of people, I think, in the spiritual space who are trying to run a spiritually based business because at the end of the day, in the modern world, in most places, may not apply to you, but if you're living in a westernized culture, then you are offering products and services for a monetary exchange. And in that practical scenario, if you are a Reiki master, you're probably working your butt off trying to barely get by, and at the end of the month, you're still barely getting by month after month. That's one way to do it. Low price point, high volume, and you're always on this treadmill. Micheila used the hamster wheel, which might be a better example, forever. Another way to structure your what you're offering is you have a tiered system, which is what Micheila was talking about. In a tiered system, the things that you do that require the most of your personal time are at the very top of the tier. So if you are working one-on-one with what you're doing, so let's say you're doing Reiki healing, it wouldn't work with Reiki, but let's just use that as an example, and you're doing a 1 hour session, and you can only work with one person in this 1 hour session, then that would be a top tier because you only have X amount of hours in our linear timeline in a given week to offer that session. So that you would offer at a premium offering, so that you wouldn't have to exhaust yourself every week to make enough money to get by. And then the next tier down would be something like classes, like Micheila was talking about. And you may be able to teach a class to 20 or 100 or hundreds of or thousands of people, really. And so that you can charge a much lower price point and help many more people, because that 1 hour you're teaching that class can serve thousands of people or hundreds of people or whatever, but not just the one person. So for that, you would charge a lower price point. And now you've gone from somebody who's a Reiki master who's maxing out doing as many sessions as they can possibly do in a week at a low price point to somebody who is charging a high price point for one-on-one sessions. And the next tier down, they're offering a lower price point for classes based on the amount of time that's required to serve the people. And the next tier might be an even lower price point. Maybe it's a different kind of workshop, or maybe it's like Micheila, for example. She wrote her book, but her book is for free on our website. So this is a book that took her years to write, and she's still editing it, even still to this day. And all that time that she put into that would not have been possible. That book would not exist if she was charging like a Reiki master would charge, and trying to do as many sessions as she can. She would have burnt herself out years ago and probably not even be doing that work anymore because of that. So, so if you structure it that way, now you can serve more people. And the next tier might be you do free live events, or like we're doing here today. We don't charge for these live stream or these videos or the live streams that we do. We don't. That's not even something on our minds that we ever want to do. We're just doing it freely. But again, our motivation isn't what a lot of people have as motivation when they make free videos. A lot of people, their motivation is, this is a free video that I'm going to put out there on social media, and it's going to generate sales for whatever it is that I'm doing. We have no such focus or interest. We are doing this because this is what we're here to do, and this is what we're good at doing, and it's our unique contribution in the world, and we're doing it just for that reason, just to purely give it to everybody who is on the other end. And that's how it has to be. And so if you tier everything that way, to the highest point, you're charging the most, and because of that, you can pay for all the other things that you're doing at very lower price points, or at lower price points, or even for free, and not even have to think about the money. So I talk about this concept a lot in various videos we've done over the years, and that is that I think that if you have an aversion to charging more for what you do when you actually need to. Now, if you don't need to, it doesn't matter. It's not an issue. But if you don't want to charge more because other people can't afford it, again, what you charge has something to do with other people. It's your relationship with Source. meanwhile you're struggling in your life financially, then you have a resistance to money and to abundance. So, you may do all the law of attraction and visualizing and vision boards. Meanwhile, if you have a resistance to money that's preventing you from charging more for what you do, then you may then that's just the same kind of resistance as the person who charges too much. So it's the same thing either way. Um, Greed is the result of resistance, and having a scarcity is also the result of resistance. You want to be in that middle place where money does not exist as something you even really think about. Sure, you may have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, but it should be like the air you breathe. You inhale it, you exhale it. You're not sitting here thinking about moment to moment whether there'll be enough air for the next breath, or if the person sitting next to you is going to suck all the air out of the room and you won't have any. It's just simply something that happens automatically. And when you're in that state, the amount you charge is irrelevant because it's not even something you think about. It just facilitates your ability to do your work and to live your purpose to its fullest expression without any limitation. And that's ultimately the role that money needs to be in your life, is this inconsequential thing you do not think about, but there is enough of it to allow you to live your purpose and your life journey to its fullest expression with no limitations. And that's where we all have to get to, and the context in which we have to treat money and abundance and resources in our lives.
And if money is not the focus of what you do, the money will come. That
Yes.
has been my experience 100% on this path. But just to open up this topic a little bit more, I think in the fifth dimension, you're living a completely different lifestyle. Trying to fit a spiritual business into the 9 to 5, I have to do these things or it's not going to succeed, never works, because ultimately you're moving from inspiration. And when you have a purpose and you have spiritual gifts, whether you're a channel or you're a healer, there are going to be things that are going to come up at the right time that you're going to be guided to do that are important for the collective. And it's also important to listen to that, because if I were to fall out of the rhythm of what the guides want me to do, I would be pushing up in resistance against this mission pretty hard and actually not having a very good experience of it myself. And that's what we're striving for. So the bottom line is the guides say we have to find joy within the experience. And I think authentically that joy comes from knowing that you're living a life of service and you're flowing with that service such that it is falling in place exactly as it should.
Yeah. So anyway, that was our show for today, and thank you all for joining us. We kind of went into a lot of different interesting topics relating to the subject of living to your soul's purpose. And we'll have these shows out every week. Next week will be another Channeled Revelation show. So hope you'll join us for that, and we'll see you next time.